Ready yourself for a dive into the chilling realm of marine terror as we explore the haunting legacy of Tilikum the Orca. Witness the terrifying ambush among trainer Keltie Bryne and the hellacious overnight onslaught on Daniel Dukes. Join us as we dive headfirst into the heart-wrenching tales of those who fell victim to Tilikum's wrath. Keltie Bryne was a strong competitive swimmer, but none of her training could manage the brute force of 3 killer whales. They toyed with her and mauled her till she drowned. The terrifying trio was led by the notorious Tilikum. Poor Keltie was bruised, battered, and beaten as these 3 killer orcas viciously dragged her underwater over and over again. Keltie was heard screaming and pleading for her life until her final breath. This is the story of Keltie Bryne, the first victim of Tilikum, history's most notorious killer whale in captivity. Keltie Lee Byrne was a good-natured girl who loved wildlife, especially marine animals. The 20-year-old biology student from the University of Victoria had decided to join the now-defunct Sealand in British Columbia. Keltie wanted to experience working with whales while also earning some extra money to begin life as a young woman. Keltie was desperate to get up close with orcas, whom she regarded as the most impressive beasts on the planet, and working for Sealand was her dream job. In the 90s, Sealand of the Pacific attracted huge crowds because of the orcas. Sealand opened in 1969 and kept several captive orcas, including their first, a female called Haida. None of the orcas took to captivity, and soon most died until Sealand finally got the terrible trio, a male named Tilikum and 2 females, Noka 4 and Haida 2. The 3 orcas had been captured from eastern Iceland, and though they were housed together, the other 2 females bullied Tilikum night after night. On several occasions, he was found battered, bruised, and bleeding. What made matters worse was how the 3 whales were kept in metal pods just 26 feet across and 20 feet deep. Tilikum was a massive 22-foot orca, so if he stood vertical in the pod, he would stick out of the water, and yet this was their home for 14 hours a day. Besides the bruises from the fights, all 3 orcas would often be found with scratches and cuts from rubbing their sides against the metal pods. But that was just part of their misery. The 3 orcas were made to perform 7 days a week, 8 hours a day, and slowly the pressure and trauma took their toll. Tilikum was never a normal whale. Even though he hated captivity, he was strangely still a playful beast, youthful and eager to learn. Most of the trainers at Sealand loved working with him instead of the other 2. Because he was so young, Tilikum often struggled with commands, and because of this, food was denied to all 3. Perhaps this is why the whales hated Tilikum and abused him, as well as showing additional signs of discontent. Nuka had already bitten one of the trainers, including a blind woman in the audience who was asked to pet her. To protect Tilikum from Nuka and Haida, Sealand kept them in a separate pod, but being smaller, it only made matters worse. The first warnings of how Tilikum was slowly turning psychotic came from biologist Eric Walters. Walters shot off screeching letters to the Canadian Federation of Humane Societies, highlighting the safety concerns he had about the aquarium.
The issue was really that we stored these whales at night in what we call a module, and the lights were all turned out. So there's really no stimulation. They're just in this dark metal 20-foot by 30-foot pool.
Eric remarked that Sealand was not providing the orcas with any type of new stimulation and knew that eventually these killer whales would crack. His chilling warnings gradually began taking shape as Tilikum displayed possessive behavior, grabbing anything that fell in the pod and refusing to give it up. On February 20th, 1991, the 3 whales seized the chance when they found Keltie Bryne had fallen into the pool. For them, it was like, oh look, the human wants to play. They were certainly not going to miss the opportunity, especially Tilikum, who went wild. Keltie Bryne was enjoying her job at Sealand and was proving to be a diligent worker. She loved the orcas, but was still not allowed to swim or interact with them. It was the afternoon and a few shows had just finished. Keltie's job was clearing the pool when disaster struck. The audience had not left yet, and several hundred people were still in their seats watching as Keltie suddenly slipped and fell halfway into the pool. For a trainer, falling into the pool was no big deal, and halfway in is also halfway out. All she needed was to pull herself up. As Keltie gripped the sides and tried pulling herself up, she felt something forceful tugging at her body. It was Tilikum, who caught Keltie by her foot and pulled her back in. Keltie became the stimulation the whales needed, but for the trainers and other eyewitnesses, it was a dangerous development. Keltie had to be brought out immediately, or it could turn fatal. With Keltie in his mouth, Tilikum raced around the pool, dragging her underwater and surfacing again. Head trainer Steve Huxter, who witnessed the incident, remarked later, "They never had a plaything in the pool that was so interactive. They just got incredibly excited and stimulated." Yes, indeed, Keltie was nothing but a live toy, and the more she thrashed around and tried to save herself, the more it excited the whales, who all joined in the fun. For Keltie, it was a nightmare. All her dreams were being dashed right before her eyes, as she knew somehow this could be the end. The three whales took turns, grabbing her each time she broke free. They did not allow her to get to the side of the pool. Tilikum was the most violent, yet in terms of whale speak, this was just horsing around and nothing more. After all, this would be the standard way of playing with prey in a pod of whales, especially large seals, and there was Keltie, a struggling human. Co-trainer Karen McGee, standing on the side of the pool with other trainers, watched in horror as Tilikum battered Keltie. As he rose above the water surface with her, she saw Keltie wave frantically, screaming her name saying, "Help me, I don't want to die." At this point, Karen threw a life ring out to Keltie, who tried grabbing it, but Tilikum would not let her. Several trainers began clanging buckets and throwing fish in the water to distract the whales, but nothing worked. Tilikum was having the time of his life. All the bullying, the pent-up frustration, and the trauma was now erupting in a moment of frenzied and violent playfulness. A large net was thrown in to try and separate Keltie from the whales. Still, it possibly backfired, causing the whales to remain underwater longer, a deadly development for Keltie's survival. The other trainers began leaning over the side of the pool and saw how the three whales bounced Keltie around underwater. She was being rammed against the sides, a sure sign that her bones were fractured. The poor woman was being killed slowly and painfully. When Tilikum rose one final time with Keltie, she was still conscious. She screamed one last time for help and then disappeared underwater again. This time, she couldn't hold out any longer. In the next few moments, Keltie died. The coroner termed it forceful drowning. Eventually, after 2 hours of being bored with a dead plaything, Tilikum let Keltie go. When Keltie's body was recovered from the pool with the help of a net, she looked terrible. Her injuries were horrendous. Keltie suffered several fractures, punctured organs, and lacerations across her body. It was truly a sad day, and ironically, one could not blame the animals for their actions. Speaking to reporters, Sealand manager Alejandro Bolt reported she had 10 tooth marks on her body, the largest on her left thigh, but otherwise untouched. The whales had stripped her clothes off. It was just a tragic accident. In stark contrast to what the eyewitness reports had stated, Sealand downplayed the incident and released an official report. The incident shocked many and enraged animal activists worldwide, commenting on how the deplorable conditions and mismanagement of such large beasts in captivity were responsible for their gruesome behavior. Keltie's death, however, triggered a moment that finally led to the closure of Sealand of the Pacific. Yet it did not lead to the freeing of the whales. SeaWorld of Orlando seized the opportunity and purchased Tilikum to protect the whale. The water park in Orlando gave Tilikum another platform to kill again, and he repeated the feat 2 more times. Although Tilikum died years later from disease, he would go down as the most famous orca whale in marine park history, and the only whale to have caused the deaths of multiple people. Keltie Bryne, Daniel Duke, and another trainer, Brancheu. The murder of Brancheu was far more disturbing than what had happened to Keltie. It made sensational news and finally led to governments cracking down on breeding orcas in captivity. Today, the debate rages on whether marine parks like SeaWorld should be allowed to use orcas as performing animals. Like Sealand in the Pacific, SeaWorld has always chosen to keep a tight lid against controversies. Even the incident concerning Brancheu was attributed to only drowning. Should children today be educated on why such entertainment is wrong for humans and animals? Perhaps with awareness, more and more people will stop witnessing such shows. But until that time comes, places like SeaWorld will continue using orcas despite the controversy. But Keltie Bryne was simply the first of Tilikum's victims. Daniel Dukes must have regretted his crazy stunt when he was pulled down by his scrotum into the tank of one of the most notorious killer whales in history. As a petty drug abuser and trespasser, Dukes was known for doing crazy things in life. The man who appeared deranged to witnesses thought he could break into SeaWorld, swim with an orca, and escape. What he didn't bargain for was Tilikum, the beloved orca, that slaughtered him in such a vicious and painstaking way. The monster whale attacked him violently when Dukes jumped into the pool. Dukes was battered and thrashed around the pool, bitten and bruised. At one point, Tilikum caught hold of his scrotum and dragged him down. When he drowned, the whale tore it off completely. When they found his body, Dukes was left totally unrecognizable. What possessed Daniel Dukes to trespass in the SeaWorld is anybody's guess. Eyewitnesses reported Dukes mumbling to himself while hanging around the entrance to SeaWorld. This was one last break-in that finally got the better of him. Dukes was a troubled man with a history of drug abuse. One particular report in the Orlando Sentinel described Dukes as a marijuana-smoking drifter from South Carolina with a string of petty arrests. While he wasn't considered violent, most arrests included drug possession, petty theft, and trespassing. Dukes didn't fit in with society and was regarded as having several issues. He was also prone to impulsive behavior and was reported to be obsessed with the game Ultima. In March of 1996, he even broke into the home of the game's creator, Richard Garriott, who fired a gun at Dukes as a warning. Instead of being scared, Dukes walked up to Garriott's bedroom, stripped himself, and tucked himself into Garriott's bed. It was there that police arrested him when they responded to a 911 call from Garriott. His neighbors described him as a gentle person who loved nature. One priest of a Hare Krishna temple near Dukes' home claimed he often fed homeless people and loved feeding wild birds. One woman named Susan wrote online that Dukes was a clean-cut, happy-go-lucky kid who had a great sense of humor. He was a good student and her friend. From the mixed responses, it was clear that Dukes had two very different personalities. Sadly, one got the better of him the day he decided to break into SeaWorld. On July 6, 1999, Dukes was seen hanging around the gates of SeaWorld, where eyewitnesses said he looked dirty. He was talking to himself and reeked of a foul odor. Just a few days before he was seen at SeaWorld, Dukes had spent 3 days in jail for stealing a Three Musketeers bar. Some of the witnesses who provided sworn testimonies said Dukes' attire was questionable, while others said he was wandering around the front gate plaza, glaring suspiciously at young girls. The eyewitnesses' statements proved that Dukes was not in a clear frame of mind. His urge to break into an establishment was too much. He just had to do it. Dukes managed to get into the marine park and stripped. He had swimming shorts beneath his trousers, which suggests he had planned his reckless stunt all along. Unfortunately, though, he chose to dive into the tank of the most notorious killer whale in the history of marine entertainment. Dukes was unaware of Tilikum, the killer whale, who showed no mercy when he wanted to kill. Tilikum was an 11-ton orca whose 22-foot frame made him look like a monster in his tank. He was a tragic victim of circumstance, a whale who never took kindly to captivity. The killer whale was captured back in 1983 in Iceland and was brought to SeaWorld in Orlando in 1992. Tilikum's transition from the vast expanse of the ocean to living in a tank was a nightmare. His training was fraught with incidents of rebellion, inviting the wrath of other orcas who repeatedly beat him up. Tilikum's frustration and pent-up rage exploded when he killed his first victim, female trainer Keltie Bryne, in 1991. On July 6, 1999, Tilikum was probably pacing around in his pool. It had been 13 years since his capture, yet he could not get used to being docile in his tin can of a home. Trainers were extremely careful with Tilikum. They knew the orca had tasted blood once, and there was no way of knowing if he would ever go berserk again. Yet, Daniel Dukes unknowingly gave him a chance to prove what a killer Tilikum could be. Whether the security cameras captured the incident is unknown, but Dukes waited for the crowd to disperse. As soon as it grew dark, he broke into the marine park and made a straight beeline for the orca tank. In his mind, he was living out one more escapade, another adventure. He could get caught or he might not. He didn't realize that this would be the last break-in of his entire life. As soon as Dukes jumped into Tilikum's tank, he may have yelled. Who wouldn't? After all, the water in the tank was a chilly 50 degrees and icy cold. Sensing the sudden movement in the water, it was doubtful Tilikum gave Dukes a warning. They are trained to understand when it is performing time and when it's not. This was not the case, nor was it common practice for humans to enter the tank at this time. This was different, so he was not required to comply with commands, and neither a whistle nor any other order was forthcoming. He was free to do whatever he pleased to the person who jumped into his tank, and with that possible thought, Tilikum attacked. Dukes had no chance and wasn't rational enough to even realize that a 22-foot killer whale was about to maul him. From his injuries, it was evident that the orca battered him, most likely with his snout. The impact of being rammed by a killer whale of this size would be enough to break Dukes' ribs, knocking him out cold. No human can withstand the force of 12,000 pounds. Dukes' bones must have shattered instantly. The whale then caught Dukes by the unlikeliest of places, his scrotum, and dragged him down to the bottom of the pool. One can only imagine the amount of torturous pain in that moment that Dukes felt. Sadly, Tilikum wasn't entirely done. The hunt had just begun. If captive orcas' attack have taught us anything, it is that they are not satisfied with their victims, even after they're dead. Tilikum then played brutally with Dukes' body, thrashing him like a rag doll, biting him, and almost churning him into putty. The next day, when the marine park trainers came around for the morning routine, the sight of Tilikum's pool horrified them. On the back of Tilikum lay the lifeless resemblance of what looked to be a human. The killer whale was proudly parading around in his pool with his new prize, and try as they might, he did not let any of the trainers near him. Eventually, Tilikum was manipulated to give up the body of Dukes, and it was shocking what the trainers found. Dukes was unrecognizable. He had lacerations, abrasions, and bruises all over his body. The most terrifying sight of all was his lower body. He had no genitals. They had been completely bitten off. Dukes' face was a mess. He looked so bizarre that his funeral had to be held in a closed casket. Unlike the first incident where Tilikum killed his trainer, the one concerning Dukes created a sensation. It was the first time the orca killed an outsider. The official report detailed how a nearly psychotic man and trespasser with little regard for his own safety drowned in a killer whale's tank. The orca's attack on Dukes may have been caught on camera, along with confirmed images of the orca swimming around with Dukes on his back, but SeaWorld has yet to release them. Daniel Dukes was indeed a troubled individual with a record of petty crimes. Still, being a human being, he will instead be remembered as Tilikum's second victim and the first significant incident at SeaWorld. The incident concerning Dukes did not do much to make SeaWorld sit up and take notice. In 2010, Tilikum would kill again in a manner that would shock the entire world. In front of a live audience, Tilikum would attack and kill trainer Brancheu, revealing a dark side to the orca, who thought nothing of attacking someone he had trained with for several weeks. The big question is, who is to blame? Is it Tilikum's fault? As one expert put it, these magnificent giant marine mammals live the equivalent of a human life in a prison cell without being a convict. The whales got bored, and when they do, they kill for sport, just like in the ocean. Be it a shark, a dolphin, or a human, they are different. Do you agree that such large animals should not be kept in captivity because the inevitable is bound to happen? From the moment she set eyes on Shamu at SeaWorld, 10-year-old Dawn Brancheu decided she wanted to work at SeaWorld. 3 decades later, she was being dragged mercilessly by Tilikum, the orca, into his tank. What triggered the ruthless attack on Dawn still puzzles the experts, but for Brancheu, it was an agonizing way to go, as the 22-foot killer whale treated her like a piece of meat. He thrashed her against the side of the tank relentlessly, breaking her bones and mutilating her until he felt her body go limp in his mouth. Even then, he wouldn't allow others near her. Dawn was Tilikum's third victim. This was never what she bargained for. This is the tragic true story of Dawn Brancheu, the SeaWorld trainer whose death changed everything. Dawn Brancheu was one of the most popular and loved trainers at SeaWorld in Orlando. She was their poster child and always the star attraction at every show. Beside the marine animals, Dawn raked in millions for SeaWorld, and her performances with orcas were the main attraction. Her Shamu show with Tilikum especially became world famous. Tilikum was used to Dawn and even shared a good rapport with her. The giant killer whale had been a performing orca at SeaWorld for 18 years, 2 years longer than when Dawn worked there. They were partners and the oldest workers there too, yet strangely their partnership ended in one of the worst tragedies that shocked the country. Dawn was born and raised in Cedar Lake, Indiana. When she was 10, her family took her on vacation to Orlando. Seeing the performance of Shamu at SeaWorld mesmerized Dawn. It changed her life forever. The majestic beauty of the orcas created an obsession for her and animals. She just had to work with them. In one interview, Dawn was quoted as saying, "I remember walking down the aisle at Shamu Stadium and telling my mom, this is what I want to do." It was her dream to do it, said Marion Laverde, Brancheu's mother. She loved her job. Soon after graduating from the University of South Carolina in psychology and animal behavior, Dawn began volunteering in animal shelters. She loved animals and kept 2 Labradors, stray ducks, chickens, rabbits, and birds at home. Dawn's love for animals finally landed her a job working with dolphins at Six Flags Great Adventure in New Jersey. In 1994, Dawn finally found her dream job at SeaWorld in Orlando. Dawn's role in SeaWorld grew into an important one. To manage the intense rigors of working with killer orcas, Dawn ensured she was physically fit and active. She ran marathons, participated in cycling races, and even pumped iron. Dawn became a leader, taking charge of the famous Shamu shows in SeaWorld. Dawn breathed new life into the Shamu show and became featured on billboards across Orlando. Ever since the first original Shamu debuted in SeaWorld, Orca always took its place, becoming an heir to the most popular brand in animal entertainment. When Dawn joined SeaWorld, Tilikum was still a newcomer, brought to SeaWorld Orlando in 1992. Tilikum, a 22-foot monster killer whale, was always a rebel. Right from his capture off the coast of Iceland in 1983 till he was sent to SeaWorld in 1992, he was never truly broken in. Tilikum lived in Sealand for 8 years. He was so notoriously disobedient that he would even get picked on by other whales for not behaving. When one orca displays disobedience, the entire pod at a marine park will go without food. The other orcas recognized how Tilikum was often the cause of their ill treatment, and they often thrashed him. On more than one occasion, Tilikum was found badly injured by other orcas. Adding to his problems was the little tanks meant for orcas. This was a creature taken from his environment, used to living in the vast expanse of an ocean, now made to exist in the solitary confines of a tin can. Tilikum was like a ticking time bomb waiting to explode, and it was tragically in the presence of Dawn Brancheu that he did. At SeaWorld, Tilikum's life was no different. Pacific Northwest whales, who regard him as an outsider, battered and bruised him. When Tilikum and Dawn met, the human and beast instantly developed a rapport. It was evident that Dawn was Tilikum's favorite human, and they developed a close bond. Senior trainer John Hargrove remarked, "He had a great relationship with her, and she had a great relationship with him. I do believe that he loved her, and I know that she loved him." On the sad day of February 24, 2010, Tilikum and Dawn were performing their famous Dining with Shamu show at SeaWorld. Beside an audience on the surface, hundreds were below witnessing the show through see-through glass in an open-air dining area. Everything was going as rehearsed. Dawn and Tilikum had done the show several times. It was all part of the job. Once they finished, Dawn laid on her stomach on the edge of the tank and began a nose-to-nose routine with Tilikum. Her long ponytail floated in the water and struck Tilikum's nose. No one is sure if this triggered his rage, but at that moment, Tilikum dragged Dawn into the water. Tilikum was no stranger to killing. He had already killed 2 trainers in the past. In 1991, he killed a young, inexperienced trainer, Keltie Bryne. In 1999, he killed 27-year-old trainer Daniel Dukes, who was so severely mutilated that there was not a single part of his body without injury. Even his genitals were bitten off. To get into the water with Tilikum and bond with him was extremely courageous of Dawn, but she eventually paid the price. The horror that unfolded at SeaWorld wasn't just caught on camera. Below the surface, hundreds of terrified tourists witnessed a horror movie come to life. People being served their cuisine felt too sick to touch their food as they saw Tilikum begin battering Dawn. The 5'4" whale dragged her deeper and began drowning her. Witnesses said he would not allow her to rise to the surface. Each time she broke free and tried swimming up for air, he dragged her back down. Tilikum began violently shaking Dawn's body. At times, he grabbed and shook her by the arm. Sometimes, he shook her by the leg. One witness described how he even thrashed and shook her around by the head. As Dawn tried escaping, he battered her with his snout. At one point, just when Dawn thought she had a chance and scrambled with all her strength towards the surface, Tilikum swam straight into her like a battering ram, hitting her squarely in the chest. Even as Dawn went limp from the impact, Tilikum went around the pool and returned, swimming at full speed towards her with his mouth open. It was as if the whale was battering a victim, his prey. People were witnessing the live mutilation of Dawn as Tilikum snapped off her arm and began chewing on it. This was even scarier than any scene from Jaws because this was being played out in real life. It was not color in the water but real blood. Dawn's blood that oozed from the mouth of Tilikum as he ate her arm. As if that wasn't enough, the whale chewed at her head and tore her scalp right off. People began screaming, and yet no one could do anything. The cruel and merciless battering broke Dawn's jaw, and one ear was seen dangling from her face. Her knees were broken. She could no longer move as her arms were fractured as well. Tilikum was a monster gone crazy. There were other smaller whales in the pool, but none participated in the bloody massacre. Meanwhile, the staff quickly swung into action, segregated the other whales into a neighboring pool, and attempted to save Dawn. Dawn was already dead. It was impossible to survive the battering she was receiving from Tilikum. Even as her body remained limp and lifeless, the whale was not done thrashing her around. Later, the coroner found that even Dawn's spinal cord had snapped and was severed in the attack. The entire staff at SeaWorld began slapping the water in hopes of intimidating Tilikum, who continued to thrash Dawn in his jaws. Paramedic Thomas Tobin rushed to the scene, but it was pointless. After 30 minutes, Tilikum was isolated in a special medical pool with a hydraulic base. Only then did trainers dive into the water to retrieve Dawn's body. One of the trainers found she had no scalp and dove back into the water only to find it laying at the bottom of the pool. As Dawn was being removed from the water, Tilikum looked agitated and tried getting back at her. It seemed the beast just wanted to rip her to shreds. Dawn was placed next to another pool, covered in a black sheet. Witnesses report seeing Tilikum repeatedly approaching the surface, trying to lift himself above the pool wall. Experts still can't pinpoint what happened to Tilikum and what triggered such rage in the Orca. Some feel he had mistaken Dawn's ponytail for a toy, but was that really the case? The incident involving Dawn Brancheu prompted a documentary called Blackfish, Death at SeaWorld, where marine scientists attempted to analyze and explain the event. They felt that Tilikum was angered for not being rewarded after the show. The most logical and likely explanation was that Tilikum had snapped after 26 years of living in captivity, suffering beatings and being traumatized by the confines of his captive environment. Do you agree that marine animals as large as Tilikum should never live in captivity and be trained for human entertainment? Was Dawn Brancheu's merciless killing a disaster waiting to happen? We may never know, but remember, Dawn was the third victim of Tilikum,